A good place to start, from a Western religious point of view, is with the first book of the Bible, Genesis. The central idea that I would like to focus on, not just at the beginning, but for some time, is that God made man in his own image and after his own likeness. But the Bible makes little attempt to explain exactly how and in what way. Consequently, Orthodox Christians' interpretations are weak and quite unconvincing. Among the more usual attempts to flesh out this verse, we find explanations like, God is a kind, loving and patient Father, and that we should emulate these or any number of other holy virtues. But having the potential to build true virtue in ourselves is quite a different matter from being created in God's actual likeness and according to his own image, unless God himself has only the potential for virtue. As it happens, when we go hunting for God's legendary virtue in the Old Testament, it is surprisingly difficult to find. On the contrary, we find a God who is jealous, angry, and breathtakingly sadistic. This, for instance, is how God reacts against his own people when they are uncooperative. There are similar verses to these in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, Lamentations, and other examples of wholly horrifying behaviour that are not difficult to find. We could easily make a very convincing case for how man was made after God's likeness if we decided God and man are only potentially virtuous. In any case, the popular mythos of the Judeo-Christian world has been that since God made man in his own image, while woman was a mere afterthought, man should have dominion over woman. He must be the head and ruler of the family, an earthly representation of divine authority. The woman should obey, acquiesce, and submit to a man because he is made in God's image, not her. And of course it follows from this point of view that God must look like a man. So religious art depicts him that way. The Jewish faith, which only accepts the book of the Old Testament as legitimate and still awaits the coming of the true Christ, is historically fiercely patriarchal and monotheistic. That is, they believe in one male God. You will not find the term or any reference to one of the central Christian dogmas, the Holy Trinity, anywhere in the Old Testament. And then, of course, the original Hebrew account of Genesis does not say God created man in his own image and after his own likeness. The Hebrew word for man is used in a collective sense, that is, mankind or humanity, as well as in a gender-specific sense when it refers to a male. So the passage of interest to us actually reads like this. Now, this revelation may shock a lot of Jews and Christians, but it is completely uncontroversial, and actually there are some Jewish legends in heterodox rabbinic literature which confront the issues raised by the correct translation, namely, how are both men and women made after God's likeness? In these accounts, the first man, Adam, is created at the same time as the first woman, Lilith, who was equal to man. She embodied the strong, independent and empowered woman archetype, while at the same time embracing her femininity and sexuality. She would not meekly submit to Adam. She would not even put herself beneath Adam during sex. Eventually, Lilith became tired of Adam's desire to dominate her and broke off the relationship, preferring to live far away from him with the animals of the forest. Adam, of course, whined to God about the unsubmissive Lilith, and so God caused him to sleep and, according to literature, used the least corrupt part of his body, the rib, from which to form a new, meek and compliant woman, Eve. The text makes an interesting qualification. It says that this was possible because Adam was born with two opposing faces. We will come back to this a little later. The Lilith creation myth draws on elements that were culturally appropriated from Babylonian, Sumerian and Akkadian divine female deities, such as Inanna, Astarte and Ishtar, and eventually by the Romans and Greeks as Venus and Aphrodite. She was, of course, demonized for not subjugating herself in a patriarchal ethos, and her name became synonymous with the night demons from Mesopotamian and Jewish legends, particularly the Jewish Lilin and Mesopotamian Lilu. So the correctly translated verse in Genesis and the creation of man and woman from rabbinic literature leaves us with two interpretive options. We can conceive God at the very minimum as a great hermaphrodite in the sky instead of a bearded old man. And actually, this point of view is often encountered in Greek Hermetic religious ideology. Alternatively, we could take the position that the use of gender is an allegory intended to convey some other meaning. The idea that God and humanity, or heaven and earth, are made in each other's likeness is much older than the book of Genesis, which might have been written as far back as 1400 BC, although most scholars agree that it was probably written about 600 BC. We find the same idea in the opening passage inscribed on the mysterious emerald tablet, which is attributed to a mythological author of Greek-Egyptian origins, Hermes Trismegistus, that is, Hermes the thrice great, although it is probably a 6th century Arabic artifact. The well-known maxim, know thyself, is perpetuated throughout the religious and philosophical world, particularly in Greek ideology, where it is sometimes mistakenly attributed to Pythagoras, Socrates, Heraclitus, and at least half a dozen others. Taken in full context, the quote introduces the idea that God, the world, and humanity are made in the same likeness, and clearly from a point of view that has nothing to do with gender or aesthetic. This idea most probably came from Egyptian schools, where the inner teaching of religious ideas were passed on to early Greek philosophers, including Socrates, who went there to study. Early Greek temples were often consecrated to Egyptian deities, and we can even find texts by some of these early philosophers stating that these schools taught them all they knew. So the Greek religious philosophical tradition has its roots in Egyptian mystery schools. But to continue, we find exactly the same appeals to knowing ourselves along the same quite unusual lines in Gnostic literature in a text attributed to Jesus. So we have an emerging picture of God, humanity, and the world created in each other's likeness and presumably according to certain principles or design. The inner teaching of historic mystery schools and Greek religious philosophical schools of thought, as well as a more contemporary ideology of Gurdjieff, uniformly understand that these principles are based on triadic arrangement. The Christian Trinity, or hypostasis, however, is quite unintelligible, inconsistent, and a superficial representation of this knowledge, which unquestionably informed it. And we will start to unpack that in the next few videos. So we find Western religious tradition has shifted from worshipping a single male god to a three-part male god consisting of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are one single god and three separate gods in their own right at the same time. But actually in between, the population entertained a dualist point of view, the idea of a two-part god embodying the male and female principle. So our Western representations of God have transitioned from a monad to a dyad and finally a triad god. It was Greek and Gnostic religious ideology in particular which carried these principles of triadic arrangement forward from ancient times until it finally reached Orthodox Western religion, albeit in a hardly recognisable form. So if we take the idea that God is a representation of these three principles of triadic arrangement seriously, and that humanity and the material world were made according to these principles, then provided we understand what they are, it should be easy enough to identify them. We will pursue this line of inquiry in the next video. Thanks for listening.